All right, so this is going to be the least warm and fuzzy 6 weeks you've had at First Church, because this is mostly technical material that I'm going to try to make understandable. Every Christian should know where they got their Bible from. It just didn't fall out of the sky, but we teach the Bible is the fully inspired, infallible, inerrant Word of God, and so we believe that it is God's authoritative voice in writing. But we should know where it came from. The Lord who ordains the ends, ordains the means to the ends. In other words, He also ordains the processes by which we receive these, the Bible. So we're going to do this in 6 weeks, and I'm going to try to highlight some basic stuff that I think would be helpful to you. First, we're going to talk about the text itself. How did we get it? Is it reliable? Some basic kind of facts like that. Then we'll talk about the transmission. How did the text get from point A to point B? You have an English Bible in your hands. How did you get that? And where did it come from after coming off papyri from the first century? And then we're going to talk a little bit about translation, because all of us are reading the Bible in translation, and that means that you have to understand that there are translation theories, and you should know what they are. And so when you're looking at a particular translation in the bookstore or on Amazon, there's a tremendous difference between one translation and another in terms of theory of translation. And that will let you know what you're going to get before you get it. And I'll teach you about that so you'll have some sense. And then when we get to that part, I'll go through some of the basic modern translations that we have, and you can see what the differences are between those. You know, why do we use the ESV, for instance? And why is the King James, whatever happened to the King James? And what happened to it? So I'll tell you all about that. But this is a bottomless pit of information, and I'm going to try to keep it as simple as I possibly can. So before we get going too hard, and it's the first week, and I have this mapped out pretty much in my head, but are there things that you just have questions about? I've always wanted to know. And I'll incorporate, don't apologize, you're fine, don't grab a handout, and you'll be good. Anything at all? And you may not think of it until later, but if you have something that you've just always wanted to know, I was always curious about X, about the Bible, I'll include it in the class and tell you how we arrived at it. All right? So here we go. You ready? I'm going to start by talking mostly tonight about the New Testament, because that is mostly what people are interested to start with, but I am going to talk about the Old Testament text in a couple classes from now, and the Dead Sea Scrolls and things of that sort, and how we got the Masoretic text of the Old Testament. But mostly what I want to talk about tonight is mostly in the New Testament. Remember that we talk about the Bible as a book, but the New Testament is not a book. The New Testament is a collection of books. And they arrived individually, all 27 of them, on individual scrolls by 9 different authors. And because that's true, in terms of historical reliability, what you have to understand is that those are 27 different source documents. And if you don't treat it that way, people will challenge you, and they'll say something on the order of, well, you know, the Bible X, and then fill in the blank, and they don't realize that they're referring to just 27 different source books. What I want to try to point out to you is also that they are early. And why is early important? Because the closer something is written to the time that it occurred, the more reliable the information. So that's important for us. So the closest thing we have besides the Bible in his ancient history writing is Homer's Iliad. The closest text we have from Homer is 400 years following the writing of the Iliad. 400 years. The next closest one is Caesar. We have just I think 7 of Caesar's documents, and the first reliable document that we have from Caesar is 1,000 years from the time that Caesar wrote it. 1,000 years. So 400 is the best, 1,000 is the second best, and then we have Plato. We have Plato, about 10 documents from Plato, and that was 1,200 years. The closest that we can get to Plato is 1,200 years. And no one, my daughter went to the University of Maine Honors College, and the Honors College teaches the Great Books system. So they don't take all the same classes as everyone else. They teach entirely by the great books. No one at the University of Maine Honors College said to my daughter, these documents are unreliable. You can bet that they fully trusted the Aristotle and Plato and Homer's Iliad with no problem whatsoever, even though those documents, there are only 7 or 8 of those documents. Homer has the most referenced documents at 1800, and none of them are within hundreds and sometimes thousands of years of the writing of those documents. No one questions those documents, but they question the New Testament. The entire New Testament was written by 70 AD, all of it, and I can prove that to you. And that means that not only do we have something close to the source, we have eyewitnesses who are writing the document themselves. And we have those documents. We don't just have 7 documents. We don't just have 8 documents. We have 5,800 copies of the New Testament from the sources. Now, some of those copies are not full copies, but from the year 200 on, we have full and reliable copies of the entire New Testament, 5,800 of them. It is the most attested ancient historical document known to mankind. No one argues with it. And I'll tell you why they do argue with it in a minute. But the fact of the matter is, if you want historical attestation, there's nothing more attested historically in ancient literature than the New Testament. And we have unbelievable amounts of that. And so it's important to do that. Now, why am I telling you that the New Testament was written prior to 70 AD? The Roman armies destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. I mean, not just a little bit, but they destroyed it. There was nothing left standing. Now think about this for a minute. Every book of the Bible that we have studied, we're studying the Gospel of John in Sunday evening worship, and if you come to Sunday evening worship in the Gospel of John, you're seeing Jesus walking in the temple, and John and the disciples in the porticos, and describing the temple perfectly. We're studying the book of Romans on Sunday morning in Sunday morning worship, and Paul is executed prior to 70 AD. So every one of the New Testament books were written prior to 70 AD. Not a single book mentions the most destructive, catastrophic event in Jewish history. It's not mentioned. Believe me, it would have been mentioned. But every New Testament book speaks and talks as if the temple is still standing. So what that means is that we have the earliest records from, and probably the latest thing written was in the mid-60s. And the earliest stuff written was around, Thessalonians was written around 42. So within 10 years of Christ's death and resurrection, and pushing it out to maybe another 34 years after that, we have everything. And we have all the eyewitnesses, which is why, do you know what the most attested passage in the New Testament is? Liberal scholars, people who deny that the New Testament has any value whatsoever historically, all say that the most reliable piece of the New Testament, if you can't trust all of it, is 1 Corinthians 15. And look what 1 Corinthians 15 says. He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. Which is an invitation to say, go ask them. Just go ask them. Do you know why the Bible still survives? Do you know why after 2,000 years of every smart aleck philosopher trying to bring the Bible down, every historical attack possible, do you know why it has not been able to be brought down? It's because of the eyewitnesses. There were so many of them. They were so reliable that you couldn't possibly challenge them. And believe me, the Roman Empire, if they could have taken Jesus' body and paraded it through the streets of Jerusalem, they would have. But they couldn't because he wasn't there. And all the eyewitnesses saw it. And they saw him after his resurrection. And the reward they got for witnessing a resurrected Jesus is death. They were brutalized, tortured, murdered, and yet they would not recant. So you cannot explain. N.T. Wright, one of the great ancient historians, Cambridge, University of St. Andrews, now retired, wrote a book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. And he said in The Resurrection of the Son of God, and this is 800 or 900 pages, but I'll summarize it for you here in like 2 sentences. He essentially said, you cannot explain the history of Western civilization following Jesus without the resurrection. It wouldn't have occurred that way. And the reason is you have a Roman Empire. Mrs. Weld, high school English, I've mentioned Mrs. Weld to you many, many times. She's a lovely woman, made us read this book called Greek mythology, you remember it? And you had to learn all these things. So we read all this Greek mythology. That was the Roman Empire. They worshipped all that foolishness. And within 300 years of Christ, the Roman Empire is officially Christian. It was illegal not to be a Christian. First it was illegal to be a Christian up to 300 AD, and then it was illegal not to be a Christian. How does that happen? And then how virtually does all of Western civilization, all the way through Europe and everything, become Christianized? How is it possible that there's a church on every corner in every country of the world? Do you realize that by 500 AD there's a church everywhere? I mean everywhere. How did that happen? And I'll show you how we know all that, because we have the translations of the Bible in all the different languages. So how does that happen? It could only occur if Jesus rose from the dead, because that's the only thing that would be enough to change people's lives in that way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we have what I call a documented document. You have 27 reliable historical documents, and not only do we have that, but we have some other things. So we have the manuscripts themselves. We have manuscripts, full New Testament manuscripts, from 200 to 300 AD forward, and we have pieces much earlier than that. That's not the whole thing. And you say, well, how come we don't have the whole thing? Because it was written on papyri. It rots. It melts. It goes away. You know, moisture kills it. You know, we didn't have a printing press until the Middle Ages, right? Mm-hmm. So everything was written on that in vellum, animal skins and things like that. And these things are subject to destruction. It's amazing that we still have that many. You can go into museums, the John Ryland Museum, you can go into all kinds of museums around the world, literally walk in and look at a New Testament manuscript from the time of the church fathers. It's amazing. The Lord has preserved his word. is simply that good. But interestingly enough, even if we didn't have the 5,800 manuscripts, which I don't even know what more you would need than that, but just say for some reason that just is not enough to convince me, then we have quotes from the early church fathers. Now, the church fathers are the early Christians. So we have Clement of Rome in 95 AD, and Ignatius in 107, Polycarp in 110. If you just took those three alone, 95, 107, and 110, and combined all of their quotes from their writings, you have the entire New Testament. All of it. Now, how is it possible for people writing in 95 AD to be able to quote the entire New Testament? Clement of Rome, who's in Rome, where was the New Testament written? In modern-day Turkey. Almost all of those letters are addressed to churches in Ephesus, Galatia, things like that. All those places are in Turkey. And Paul was writing mostly from Turkey. Rome, Clement of Rome, in 95 AD, 95 AD, is writing now already theology. Book after book of it. And his writing alone almost, if you compiled the quotes, almost compiled the entire New Testament by 95 AD. In Rome. What does that mean? That means that the documents were written much earlier than that because they had to have time to be copied and then circulated all the way to Rome. That takes a lot of time. There's no GPS, there's no fax machines, you understand? You write them out. And so scribes would copy the manuscripts word for word. And they were fastidious about it. And I'll tell you little stories later on in the class, but they literally would do a word count and a letter count. You didn't have enough letters. Something's wrong. Go back and they'd throw the manuscript away and rewrite it. That's how it was done. And they were crazy about this because they felt it was the Word of God. So we have quotes for the entire, if we did not have these 5,800 manuscripts, we'd still have the entire New Testament in quotes. All of it. From 100 AD. For within 60 years of Christ. Now people say, oh, come on, if you have the entire New Testament by 70 AD, and Christ, let's just say for the sake of argument, is crucified and rises again in, say, 33, just to pick a number. So now we've got 33, 40 years maybe, depending on how you want to count that. I say, well, that's too far away. Are you kidding me? I'm 65 years old. I still remember what my college roommates were doing. I remember everything. And I still am ticked about it. Right? I mean, we remember all that stuff. But of course, we didn't have to remember it. They didn't have to remember it because they were eyewitnesses. It's important to understand how reliable a document we have. And then translations. How many translations by the year 500 AD do we have? 20,000. The Bible was a translated document from day one. They couldn't get it out fast enough. I mean, you talk about missionary zeal. Just think of it this way. So Peter's preaching on the day of Pentecost in Acts, and 3,000 people come, and the miracle is that they are preaching in unknown languages so that people could hear and understand the gospel. In other words, the Lord gifted them with language. Well, guess what they wanted the minute they heard the gospel in their own language? A copy of the scriptures. And guess what they did? They translated the copy of the scriptures. We have the entire Bible translated into Latin by 400. Coptic, Syriac, Arabic. We've got all kinds of, we have 20,000 translations alone. If the problem is, well, I'm concerned that we don't have enough reliable historical documents, I assure you the New Testament is the most historically reliable ancient document in the history of mankind. Nothing else even comes close. It's not even a close call. So don't feel sheepish about this. You can literally bury people in the evidence. And by the way, all these, smart alecks, down at the tavern talking about this, what you'll be burying them in is Greek. And they can barely read English. So you're going to win. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. We have plenty. Any questions before I get to some of the eyewitnesses? No? Well, isn't this going smoothly? All right. Well, if that wasn't enough. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. I apologize.
What year did you say that we had, by what year was it 20,000 translations?
Oh, by 500, at least, yeah. So now people are going to talk about the eyewitnesses and say, well, they're not reliable because, they were biased. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit too, because that really is kind of nonsense if you think about it for just a minute. Has anyone ever said to a Holocaust survivor, your eyewitness testimony is unreliable because you were there? Think about this for a minute. I mean, honestly, please, before you speak, just think. That's all. I don't ask a lot. All right. So we have all kinds of external witnesses. It isn't merely that the Bible is the only one that talks about Christ. And I've listed a few there for you: Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny, Thales, Suetonius, Lucian, Celsus, the Jewish Talmud, and I can't go through all of those. But we have at least 10 outside Roman historian sources and biographies. A couple I didn't name were people you'd probably never heard of, but they were like slaves and things like that who wrote their own biographies. It's not just that they make a passing reference to Jesus. They describe his brother. They describe the fact that he was crucified. All the facts. You could literally put together a great deal of Jesus' life by these 10 different sources that were completely outside of the scriptures. Everybody knew who Jesus was. And what you have to understand is in the timing of the Lord, Jesus comes in the middle of what is still considered the most powerful empire in the history of mankind. The Roman Empire has never been duplicated before or since. And guess what the Roman Empire did? They wrote everything down. There are inscriptions everywhere. There are records everywhere. And all of them, you're going to see in a bit here, validate everything that the New Testament talks about. The reason you have a senator is because there were a Roman Senate. I mean, the reason you have a republic is because Plato wrote the Republic. I mean, we are so dependent on the Roman Empire that it's unbelievable. And so in the timing of God, God didn't choose for Jesus to come at some obscure period of time, but in the providence of God, Jesus came in the middle of the most attested, powerful empire in the history of mankind. You can walk into any university today and do a PhD in Roman history, and you cannot believe the detail. It's unbelievable. No one denies that Jesus lived. That's not the denial. When I say no one, I mean people with a brain. People who have, academic credentials. What they deny is that he was God in the flesh. That's the issue. But no one at all denies that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by Rome through Pontius Pilate as the governor in 33 AD. Nobody. It's a fool's errand, historically. Nobody. So we have all kinds of external eyewitnesses. But I want to talk for a little bit before we leave tonight. And next week we're going to do actual manuscripts. What were they made of? How were they written? What did they look like? We'll do all that. But I want to talk about the internal witnesses. Remember, as you're reading your New Testament, particularly the book of Acts, they've just gone out from the ascension, and they're witnessing, and they're going into all the world and preaching the gospel because that's what Jesus told them to do. And what do they base all of their testimony on? And I just gave you one little quote. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. That's the entire argument through the entire book of Acts. We saw this. We saw it happen. And you don't just get it in Acts, you get it all over the place. But you don't have to rely on merely the fact that they were witnesses. You have to look at what sort of testimony that they gave. So think about it this way. Every one of the New Testament records puts everything in the historical crosshairs. It is so easy, if any historical fact in the New Testament was wrong, it's so easy to prove it wrong. In the time of Tiberius, such and such. Well, if it wasn't the time of Tiberius, guess what? How easy would that be to prove? But it can be proved simply because it's all 100% correct. So for instance, I'll give you an example. If you're going to write a story currently, and you want to be historically accurate, and you start writing a story that, think about it, includes miracles and things like that, things that you could otherwise easily discount. And then you say, this all happened when John Kennedy was alive and Goldwater was running against him, and you started dating it and naming the most prestigious people in the world at the time. You better be right about that. Because all the power and the political power could be brought against you. So I've given you a little handout on your second page. And I want you to see something. In the New Testament, we have here roughly 30 names of real people in the Roman Empire that were powerful, who are written about, sometimes have full biographies written about them by Roman historians. These were people of prestige and power and influence. And all of these people are named not only in the New Testament, you'll see in the middle column where they're named, but on the right I've shown you where they were named outside of the New Testament in non-Christian sources that confirm exactly what the New Testament said about them. Now think about this for a minute. If you're going to be writing about all these powerful people, do you want to take a chance that you're wrong on the history? It's not a good look. It's not a good look. Luke, just in the last half of Luke, he lists, and I don't know why this number stuck in my head, but there are 86 different references, historical references, that have proven to be accurate and correct. Do you realize that the Gospel of Luke wrote Luke and Acts, right? And he wrote them as twin documents. Luke and Acts were written, and do you realize that they are used as some of the most reliable historical source work for first century historians? And the reason that he's so credible is that he writes with such a calm, he just sort of simply states a historical fact. And the reason they discount it is because the next thing he says, and oh, by the way, he was raised from the dead. And then, oh, by the way. And literally, with that level of calmness, he doesn't hype the miracles, he doesn't do anything, but he writes history and miracle as if they were perfectly identical. And first century historians already take Luke Acts as one of the most reliable source documents of ancient history. All they say is, I don't know, he was a doctor, so he was crazy for miracles, this guy. He called everything a miracle. but they don't discount the fact of the history, and you shouldn't either. And so these are real people. You can look them up if you like reading Roman history. Go ahead and have at it. I mean, honestly, there are libraries full of the history of the Roman Empire. You can't get to the bottom of it, but they're all here.
Quick question, ossuary?
Yes, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. For the sake of the camera, an ossuary. I'll just do it now. Why not? I was going to talk about this under culture, but as you probably know, Jews and Muslims do not embalm. They don't embalm, they don't cremate, and they don't do anything except bury that body the first 24 hours. That's all that's done. So they'd never allow an autopsy, for instance. That would be just, they would never do it. So what would happen, though, is a year or so later, they would dig up the bones and put them in an ossuary, which is a little box of bones, and they would often put more than one family member in there. You know, put the husband and wife in, the kids, people would be in there. And that ossuary would have an inscription on it. These are the bones of, things like that. And so archaeologists find tons of information in ossuaries. And they have whole graveyards full of ossuaries. And they still find them to this day, but that's what an ossuary is. Yeah, you're welcome, my pleasure. All right, so not only do we have real people, but now, as you're looking through your New Testament and reading it, you have real geography. None of it's wrong. All the towns are in the right place. All the towns are from the right distance. Everything is exactly, where it's supposed to be. All the topography works. All the streams are in the right place. All the rivers are in the right place. All the lakes are in the right place. All the roads are in the right place. They're all talking about going in the right direction. All of this stuff could be easily torn to pieces were it not true. If all the apostles were doing, who were writing the New Testament, these 9 people, if they were just writing legend or myth, this is the kind of stuff that would get lost in the shuffle. Because legend and myth is written so much after the historical fact. But the reason that all of these things line up is because they were there. They were the eyewitnesses. And so they walked the road with Jesus. When Jesus appeared on the road to Emmaus, guess what's there? The road to Emmaus. And so all of these things completely line up. All the mileage is right. We saw that Sunday night, right? You can look on a map today. Larry went to the Holy Land, and what he did walking around was find out that everything is in the right spot. Just where it's supposed to be. Well, you wouldn't have that unless it was historically accurate and reliable. So it's not merely that you have eyewitnesses. You have eyewitnesses who are in the right place at the right time, describing the right politicians, the right power players. Everything is exactly right. There are 26 towns and cities mentioned in the New Testament. Every one of them are correct, in the correct place. You couldn't get that unless you were there. You had to count on the eyewitnesses. Now we have, not only that, but we have real names. Real names. Now, what do I mean by real names? You realize that names are popular at particular periods of time. I don't know what everybody's naming their kids now, but we don't like it, do we? Whatever it is, we don't like it. What happened to Bob? Bob was a good name, but they got all these different names now. Names you don't even recognize, right? It's true. If you go back in time, my grandmother from Cherryfield, Maine, her name was Mayola. No one would dare to name their little girl Mayola now, but that was a popular name. My grandfather's name, her husband, Herbert. So Herbert and Mayola were coming over for some blueberries. Perfect. No one would name their kid Herbert and Meidahl today. Nobody. Why? Not popular. So when Brenda and I, we had 3 children, right? Every time we were going through the book. 13,000 names. Nope, 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 nope. No, no. I mean, you're hunting for the names. And because they publish now all the popular names of every year. And you can look up, and that first name will say, everybody in America named their kid, Leah, on that particular day. Well, guess what? That's always been true. And you probably may not realize this, but historians are a funny group. I mean, what they concentrate on. But you got to get a PhD in something, and since everything's been written about, there are whole people who specialize in names. Is it the right name for the right place at the right time? And so I wrote this down. So there are people who've done this for the first century in Palestine. And you can go to Oxford, Cambridge, and those places, and you can have a class by these guys. Distinctive naming patterns. So the 2 most popular boys' names were Simon and Joseph. 2 most popular. 2 most popular girls' names at the time were Mary and Salome. Salome. Guess what John was? Number 5. Close. Close. 5. John was number 5. Which is why the New Testament always says things like John of Arimathea instead of John from Bangor. The reason that you get the distinguishment is because the names were so popular. Jesus is Joshua, 7th, 8th most popular name. So he goes from actually what is a completely undistinctive name in the first century to now the name that's above every name. Everybody in the whole universe knows who Jesus is. Think about that for a minute. How did that happen? What's your explanation? You think that happened by accident? I just don't think so. Real people, real geography, real names, and real culture. If you read any New Testament historian or New Testament scholar, they will put it to you this way, and they mean it as a compliment. The New Testament is so Jewish. It's just so Jewish. I mean, it is. If you understand anything about Jewish culture at all, the New Testament is just dripping with Jewish culture. Everything about the culture is right in the written record. The economics are right. The tax system is right. Remember, we had tax gatherers. The coins are right. We have the coins. We have the coins. You can go look at them. Everything is correct. The ossuary is part of the culture. That's correct. No one would know that unless it was true. If you were writing hundreds of years after the fact, I mean, just think when they were finding the first ossuaries. They didn't even know what they were at first. And so you had to be part of the culture to know what that stuff is. And yet it's all in there. The language is absolutely correct. So I'll give you an example. Remember, language moves, right? We speak English, but you don't speak Elizabethan English. You don't. In fact, you would have a hard time understanding Beowulf. You couldn't possibly speak it. So I'll give you a couple examples. It's unlikely that Malachi would have even understood Moses. It would have changed the speaking language. He would have been able to read the same Bible, because that thing we can prove didn't change a bit. But language changes. And so think about this in English. If you take the Oxford Standard English Dictionary, I mean, the thing is, you can't get it on the shelf. Because what they do is they'll go through and take a listing, and then they will list the definition by time period. And you can watch how language moves over time. And I'll give you an example that you all know. If I said that Dick and I had a gay-o time last night, I would be fired.
You're in the wrong show.
Be in the wrong church, for sure. We'd be in the wrong church. But if during F. Scott Fitzgerald's time, said, you know, if you want to read Great Gatsby, Dick and I had a gay time last night, it means we did it the old-fashioned way. Right? Why? Because that word has changed. Which is why you'll see when we do we have to have new translations every 30 years or so. I have a book upstairs in my library called The Dictionary of the King James Version. Because I could bring you words out of the King James Version that you have no clue what they mean. No clue at all. Or they would mean something that's the opposite of what you think it means, even though it's the same word, because words have changed that much. Why am I telling you all that? Because the language in the New Testament is absolutely perfect for the first century Greek. Absolutely perfect. Obviously, I can read the New Testament in Greek, but I can't read Plato. Why? Because I can't read classical Greek. It's completely different. I can't read Aristotle, I can't read it. I mean, I had professors in seminary who could read it. I can't read the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was written 300 years prior to Christ. I mean, it's very difficult. I get it wrong a lot. But I can read the New Testament in Greek, but then it moves away after that. The reason that we know that the New Testament, one of the reasons we know the New Testament is reliable and wasn't written after the fact is because we have all kinds of other documents from the first century written in the exact same style and usage of language, and that's some of the ways that we've determined what words mean in the New Testament. We've had to go outside of the New Testament to find out. Do you know the New Testament is full of what's called hapax legomata? That's a fancy word for means the word only appears one time in the New Testament. And you know, that's a lot of memorization if you're going to memorize all those words. And so the way if it only appears one time, of course the context helps you a lot, but what you do is you go outside of the New Testament to the common Greek documents of the time in the Roman Empire, and that word is somewhere, and it's used, and it helps you determine what was written. You couldn't do it if the New Testament was written at any other time. It had to be written in that period of time before 70 AD. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. It'd be like saying Dick and I had a gay time last night. It'd be the same thing. All right? And linguists know this. And so, you know, you just have to know that this is what, you know, linguists study. Now let's turn to this last thing before we wrap it up for tonight. Legend, liars, or legit. What do we mean by legend, liars, or legit? What's important to understand about the New Testament is that even though people will kind of throw this out as if the New Testament is either a legend or it's written as a myth. But legend and myths are written in particular ways that the New Testament defies. It just doesn't look like legend or myth. We have all kinds of legends and myths. Legends expand and they exaggerate and they do all this stuff, and they're written so far away from the time that they're proposing to write. In other words, it's sort of apocryphal documents, that it's easy to tell that it's a legend and a myth. But when you read the New Testament, it just doesn't read that way, for all the reasons we've been describing. But I want to give you a couple of more ideas that maybe you haven't thought about. If people are writing the New Testament, ask yourself this: if they were writing legend, if they were writing myth, would they put it that way? Would they do it this way? And so let me give you a few of these. I've listed 4, 5, or 6, whatever A through F means. First of all, embarrassing detail. If you're writing myth, you don't admit to embarrassing things. You don't do that. And you know, if you're writing, and if you're Peter, you don't admit that Jesus, the Son of God, the subject of the New Testament, called you Satan. But Jesus did. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." He said this to Peter. You don't admit that. If you're writing myth and you're Peter, You don't admit that the guy you're writing about you denied 3 times. You wouldn't admit that if you were writing myth and legend. It would be. And by the way, how does the writer of Mark know, the Gospel of Mark, know that Peter did that? Peter had to admit it. He had to tell him. Myth doesn't work that way. History works that way, but not myth. If you were Peter, would you admit that the guy you're writing about, that you say that is the center point, the pivot point of your life, and that his life, death, and resurrection is the only thing that can save you? Read First Peter. Would you admit, if you were writing myth, that you hid while he was being crucified? That you didn't show up? You were nowhere to be found. He didn't believe the resurrection because he didn't run out there. None of them did. None of them went to the tomb. Who went to the tomb? The women. They were like having a beer down at the local. They didn't even believe it. Would you admit, if you were writing myth, that you, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, was publicly rebuked for false doctrine by the Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians? Would you admit that? No. Only history does that. So the Bible is completely reliable because it reads as history, because real facts are there, embarrassing facts. Listen to all the uncomfortable things that Jesus said. Yeah, let the dead bury the dead. You don't say that. If you're writing myth, it sounds mean. I mean, you just don't say stuff like that. You don't call people whitewashed sepulchers. If I do that, people say, you're not fit to be a pastor because you're kind of mean. But Jesus did it all the time. You don't put the embarrassing detail in. You don't. Second, resurrection reporting. Without the resurrection, we're men most miserable. The resurrection is the reason we're Christians. If the resurrection didn't happen, go fishing. There's no sense in any of this. But the resurrection changed Western civilization because too many people saw a man that was dead, then alive. And so, wouldn't you want to have that reported by the best and the brightest? Wouldn't you want to say, boy, if we're going to have a resurrection, the team for witnesses that we want to have to tell everybody about this are the most reliable, upstanding kind of people in the world. We're going to put Billy Graham on this, and maybe Albert Einstein, some people like that, boy, they're irrefutable. Who were the first witnesses to the resurrection? Women. Now look, don't get mad at me, ladies. I know, it's a different world, it's a different time, a different place. Women weren't even allowed to testify in court in the first century because they were not reliable, considered unreliable. Now, we have judges on the Supreme Court, but you could even testify in court, right? And then, of course, one of the women was Mary Magdalene. She was demon-possessed. You going to send your demon-possessed person out to witness to the resurrection? If it's not history, and if it's just myth, isn't somebody going to say, yeah, the demon-possessed chick saw him alive again? I mean, honestly, it's so easily dismissed unless it's history, right? So resurrection reporting. Confirmed public figures. I gave you the list of these. And it's not just that. It's when Paul is testifying, who's he testifying before? You forget this. When they're going to execute Paul at the end of the book of Acts, and it's Acts 26, and they're going to throw him in jail, and they're going to let him cool his heels for a while, and then do you remember what happened? He gets beheaded, right? He gets decapitated. And he stands before King Agrippa in Acts 26, and Festus and Queen Agrippa, and what do they say to him? You're crazy. Paul, you're crazy. And do you remember what his answer is? King Agrippa, you know of these things. And he did. And he did. You don't drop names like that unless it's history. You know what historians will tell you, right? The powerful people write history. The winners write history. It looked for all the world as if Rome had won. So you don't write that stuff down unless it's verifiable, because it was so easy to have it be unverified, to be discounted. But the reason it has stood this test of time is because it could not be discounted. The eyewitnesses are the reason we still have a Bible. Your whole Bible is based on eyewitness testimony. That's why you have it. And if you don't start there, you never understand the Bible. You are reading the eyewitness testimony of people who were there, who saw him when he was raised from the dead. And you can't discount that any more than you discount a Holocaust survivor who says, I was there. I've got the numbers right here. You don't discount them. We don't discount anyone who survived the concentration camps. We don't discount anyone who was at Dachau. We don't discount any one of the Japanese from the internment camps. We accept all their testimony as reliable and true. Why? They were there, and it's history. And we do that in every point of history. The reason you have a Bible is the record of the eyewitnesses of Jesus and the resurrection. Not only do you get that, but you get divergent details. Now, why is that important? People get all funky with me about that. You know, it's like, well, you know, Steve, in one gospel it said one angel showed up at the tomb. In the other gospel it said 2 angels showed up at the tomb. Ergo, it's a contradiction and a lie. I'm like, what are you, crazy? Honestly. By the way, this is my soft approach to pastoring. What are you, crazy? Listen, this is what any good lawyer will tell you. My daughter's just finishing up law school this year, and this is what she'll tell you. If 2 eyewitnesses come into a court of law, and their testimony is precisely the same, then they've worked it out before and they're lying. They are definitely lying about it. What makes a witness reliable is if the substantial story is the same, but there's some divergent details here and there. So one records 2 angels and the other one only remembers 1. If you take any 4 people and you set them around the traffic light up here by Walgreens and all that, and just set them around there, and then just wait 10 minutes, and then send a couple other cars and just have them smash into each other right in the middle of the intersection, right? And then take the testimony of those 4 people, there'll be 4 different color cars. They can't get anything right. Because that's eyewitness testimony. The reason that the testimony of the New Testament is reliable is because there are divergent details. That's what makes it reliable. If it was all a pat story, someone wrote it as myth and someone wrote it as legend. No, eyewitnesses always diverge on this little detail, that little detail, this and that and the other thing. Those aren't contradictions. One person saw 1 angel at the tomb, the other one saw 2. That means there were 2 at the tomb. Stop it. It's not that hard. It's just not that difficult. Challenges to check. The New Testament writers literally say, if you don't believe me, go ask them. When we quoted 1 Corinthians 15 at the top of your handout tonight, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. That's Paul saying, go ask them. Have you noticed when you're reading through your New Testament and the Gospels, it will sound weird to you because you'll be reading along and then there'll be some name come up and, Bob Smith of so-and-so from Guilford did this and he did that and, blah, 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 and you're like, why is that even in the Bible? It's because it's an invitation to go talk to an eyewitness. And Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexandria and Rufus. Who cares? You ever heard of him since? No. Well, why is that in the Gospel of Mark? Well, because of the next phrase. Carried the cross for Jesus. Read it. Go ask him. He's sitting out by the porch over there. Simon of Cyrene. I can't even speak. Simon of Cyrene. Because Simon is one of the most popular names, right? Remember? Mm-hmm. And since it's a popular name, there might have been two of those guys there. But this particular guy was the father of Alexander and Rufus, just so you get the exact right Simon. He carried the cross for Jesus. Go ask him. That's why the Roman Empire couldn't tear it down. That's why it's never been able to be torn down in the last 2,000 years. The eyewitnesses are too reliable. The Bible documents, we have thousands of them. We have the entire New Testament quoted by the time of the first century by outside writers. The entire thing quoted. We have translation after translation after translation. We have all real people, real geography, real names, real culture, all this embarrassing detail, resurrection reporting, confirmed public figures, divergent tales. We have all of it. But the thing that you have to understand, this is what N.T. Wright was writing about. People say, well, you know, they were biased eyewitnesses. Now, we think that's silly because of the Holocaust. They were just convinced of Jesus, and so, of course, they wrote positively about someone they were convinced about. That's the wrong question, Slick. The question is, why were they convinced? You take people with 2,000 years of cultural practice, 2,000 years of circumcising their babies on the 8th day, 2,000 years of not eating pork, 2,000 years of rabbis, and 2,000 years of the law of Moses, and 2,000 years of knowing that if you violated the Sabbath, you got stoned. 2,000 years, and in an instant, drop it all. Drop every bit of it. Wouldn't you say, what did you see to make you do that? And it records in Acts that priests drop. Pharisees dropped it and became converted. Why? How in the world would you deny literally 2,000 years of your cultural identity in a moment? No offense for the cameras, but we're in Maine, so if you're listening across the country, you don't understand the issue. So just accept it that we do. You ever tried to convert a Catholic in Maine? Good luck with that. And they've been a Catholic for what? 20 minutes compared to that? But if they saw the resurrection, I bet it changed. And so what changed the entire course of Western civilization so that an entire people group dropped it, everything, and became committed to Jesus Christ? No more circumcisions, we're going to do baptisms. No more Sabbath day. It's the Lord's Day. By the way, when they accepted the Lord's Day, was Sunday a work day for them? It was at that time. So guess what they had to do? Lose a day's pay. Okay, good talk. They dropped the temple priests. They dropped everything. They dropped the synagogues, and all of a sudden they were worshiping in a thing called a church. Overnight. Overnight. They were being executed for their faith, burned at the stake, decapitated, thrown into the Colosseums. All for what? A lie? You might die if you believed something was true but just didn't know any better, right? Okay, I was confused. All right, you know, had I known that wasn't true, I wouldn't have died. But these guys knew it wasn't a lie and voluntarily went to death. Every single apostle died for the faith. Every single one. Now, what are you going to do about that? Well, you can either say this was a legend or a myth, or you can say it's reliable history. And if it's reliable history, that means hundreds and thousands of people saw the resurrected Christ. And if Jesus rose from the dead, guess what? He's right about everything. You better pay attention. You better pay attention. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your word, how reliable it is. You promised that you would preserve it, and you did. And we thank you for that, and we pray tonight that through your Spirit you'll apply it to our hearts for the sake of Jesus, we pray. Amen.